Welcome to Connecting the Dots on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. This episode is called Trump versus Cuba. Is Cuba really a threat to the United States? Our co-host for the show is DeSoto Brown. Welcome to the show, DeSoto.
Thank you for having me, Jay. As I say every time we get together, there's always so much to talk about in Trump land these days in the United States and the entire world. We're focusing just on one part of the overwhelming amount of disruption that Donald Trump lives off of, thrives off of, takes great pleasure in inflicting upon people in the United States and the rest of the world. So it's very difficult to pick what to talk about. But today we're going to talk about Cuba and what Trump is trying to do to Cuba and why we think he might be trying to do that.
Oh, yeah. Well, he wants the Caribbean. He wants his manifest destiny. I think he wants to undermine the sovereignty of Cuba. He wants to achieve regime change, even though they're resisting that. So whatever he publicly claims about Cuba and the justifications for punishing it, which is exactly what he's doing, nothing he says is going to be above board or truthful. We can speculate about his actual motivations, but we must continue to observe what's going on, whatever he says in his discussions, which are taking place right now with the Cuban government. So what's the connection between Venezuela and Cuba?
Well, I was just going to be bringing that up. And it's very relevant to point out that the justification for attacking Venezuela, which has been going on, started several months ago at least, was the supposed narco-terrorism. And there are, in fact, drug cartels that function in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. And in some cases, they do bring drugs to the United States. However, the claim that Venezuela was a threat to the USA via fentanyl particularly, but drugs in general, justifying the attacks and the killing of people in small boats, which, we've never seen any proof that they were really carrying drugs or that those drugs were in fact destined for the United States, led to the kidnapping and abduction of Maduro, who was the president of Venezuela. Now, So Maduro is now in the United States awaiting trial. The United States has been able to simply go to another country, kidnap its leader, and bring him to the United States, which is a shocking development in international relations, nonetheless. Venezuela is important to Cuba because, as Cuba has been cut off by more and more other countries under the guidance and pressure of the United States, economically, that is. Venezuela was one of the countries that they relied upon for oil because Venezuela is a major oil producing country. Cuba has no oil. Cuba's infrastructure is collapsing, and Cuba requires oil to burn to generate electricity. And at this point, their electrical grid is in absolute chaos. And if their Venezuelan oil is cut off, and the oil from Mexico as well, which Mexico said they would continue to support Cuba, Trump, as usual, threatened Mexican exports with tremendous tariffs if they were brought into the United States. And that economic pressure means that Mexico is probably not going to be able to continue to supply Cuba. That means that Cuba it already is on the verge of collapse, and this is going to make it even worse. And that's what Trump wants, because Trump wants to step in and take over Cuba. And he wants to do that there are various speculations I can put out as to why Trump wants to destroy Cuba, because that's really what he wants to do. The first is that Cuba, since 1959, but the takeover of Fidel Castro, became a very strong economically communist nation. And particularly at the time that happened, during the Red Scare, during the Cold War, when Russia was the evil empire that was exporting communism all over the world. The United States was very against all of that. And it was a shock for the United States to have a communist country suddenly appear so close to the United States, just 90 miles away to the south of Florida. So that of itself has always been something that bothered people. But as Cuba's economically became a communist nation, a number of Cubans fled from Cuba to the United States, specifically Florida. And those expatriates, those refugees, were given special treatment for many decades of if you were able to reach the United States physically, set your foot on American soil, you were fast tracked to naturalization, which nobody else from any other country in the world was allowed to do. Well, there's a substantial expat Cuban community in Florida, particularly South Florida. And there are other refugees from other countries like Venezuela there as well. And they're all very right wing, not all, but the majority of them are right wing because they're very anti communist. And so a lot of them are Trump supporters. So if Trump takes over Cuba, he's going to be making that particular part of the population very happy. And a lot of them are going to be rubbing their hands together in anticipation of being able to go back to Cuba, reclaim what was theirs, and or go back to Cuba as capitalist people from the United States. And I think that not only does Trump want to play into them because Florida, of course, is a very red state. They are a very red part of a very red state. Some of them have become disillusioned with Trump because of the ICE activities and because of the evil things that he under or in his administration ICE has done to people like them. But one of the things is, as I just mentioned, that this brings to mind is Cuba is an untouched country for exploitation at the moment. There are no major their tourist facilities at this point are a wreckage and in wreckage like everything else in their economy. And even though American tourists have been prohibited from going to Cuba for decades, and they were once, up until 1959, a major part of the Cuban economy because American tourism was a big thing. There are people from other countries, Canada in particular, who also go to Cuba because it's warm. Well, that's a tourist market that is ripe for people to step into and turn into a major tourist location, which it was, and which it could be again if a lot of capitalist money flows in there and starts developing things. You've also got a population which is desperate to earn money because their economy is so terrible. So you'd be able to hire people for very cheap to work. So if you are thinking, I want to build a hotel in Cuba, you're thinking this is something that if I have enough capital to do this, I could make huge amounts of money. There also is the feeling of vengeance because those expat Cubans are still very embittered about what they lost. Now, the first wave of people who left Castro's Cuba 1959, 1960, 1961, all of those adults have passed away. They're not with us anymore. But there have been people throughout time, even up till today, who have fled from Cuba because it's economically so distressed and you have no future there. If you're a young person, you realize you're stuck there with no way to ever earn a decent wage. So you leave. So all of those people are going to have some level of anger against the Cuban government that now exists. They're going to want to take vengeance. They want to go back. They want to denounce what the government did to them, and they want to go back. And in some cases, maybe they have the sense of they want to help their fellow country people of the Cubans. But in other cases, I think they want to, as I said, they want to take vengeance for what they lost and what's been done to them. So it may be things like that are percolating in the background of what Trump is doing, because of course, Trump is always going to be approached, as every government official is, by people pushing their own agendas. So if somebody from a major hotel company goes to Trump and says, we could expand into Cuba, Trump may very well say, great, okay, I'll overthrow the country and we can have Sheraton and Hilton, all these companies go in there. You guys can do whatever you want. There's also Cuba in the past has been a pawn of other imperialist countries, including the United States, particularly after 1898. But at the moment, it's not a major pawn between, for example, the other two adversaries of the US, which is Russia and China. It's not like they're rushing in to try to get something. China is expanding its influence throughout the world through economic aid, which is what the United States used to do, which is the which is the calm, tactful, nice way to get control of other countries or at least become friendly. And now that's been ended because Trump doesn't like it, and the Trump MAGA supporters think it's denounce that as well. But I don't think China is as much of a deal right now. Certainly, they're not doing as much openly as they are in some other places. So I don't think Cuba is as important as a stepping stone as it has been in the past. So I don't know that that's as much of what Trump's motivation is. But as you said too earlier, you touched upon, Trump stated after the kidnapping of Maduro from Venezuela that now the United States is going to run Venezuela. And if that's what he also wants to do with Cuba, again, it's just imperialism. It's just, we're going to step in because we're bigger, stronger, economically, we're more powerful. We're going to push you little countries around, and we're going to exploit you for whatever we can get from you. Venezuela has oil. That's something that the United States can seize control of. Cuba doesn't really have that much. It's more of its physical position. But also, I think, again, as I've been sort of alluding to, as a small, very weak country that's been an adversary of the United States since 1959, Trump may, and the people around him just may have this idea of, they've been too uppity, they've been too pushy, they've insulted us, they've tried to push us around for all this time, and they're like an annoying fly or something, or a mosquito. We are so powerful we could slap them and kill them. And so maybe it's time for us to show them who's boss and start pushing them around and not allowing them to speak disrespectfully to us anymore, because we're the big people, we control stuff, and we're going to push you around. So maybe it's just that Donald Trump is so juvenile. Donald Trump is such a child that it could be something as absurd and ridiculous as, I'm annoyed with them, therefore I'll crush them. And we just don't know.
You said that most of the people who were alive in those times are gone now, but don't those things have an effect on Cuban-American relations? That is, both both the missile crisis and the Bay of Pigs.
Well, there's one other thing I want to add to that, which was in October of 1960. Castro took over January 1st, 1959, and he initially stated he was not a socialist and not a communist, and gradually began to reveal that he was. And in the summer and fall of 1960, Cuba nationalized, meaning took over all foreign assets, particularly, which were mostly American. America was the country that was most in control. So at that time, major assets were lost by not only individual United States citizens if they owned property there, but more importantly, major companies. So all of the oil refineries and all of the gas stations that were owned by American oil companies, and Cuba at that time had a lot of gas stations because they were very much, they were like the United States in terms of car ownership. So a lot of Cubans owned cars at that time. So those assets were all seized. And then a short time after that, in October, all the remaining assets were seized. So that, for example, was a Hilton hotel. That, for example, was more than one Coca-Cola bottling company, and other assets owned by American countries. Those owners never received any financial payment for what happened to them. So the United States government formed a commission to keep track of what those losses were. And those losses are still considered eligible for demanding payment from the Cuban government. Well, that's preposterous because, economically speaking, if you run a business, if you had a financial loss 66 years ago, you no longer count that. You wrote that off. But that's still a sore point that the United States could and will use against Cuba. But and that was one of the instigators of the embargo, because the embargo against Cuba has existed since 1961, and it's very strict. So that the United States, which had been exporting huge amounts of, for example, consumer goods to Cuba, cut all that off except for humanitarian stuff. And that's been in effect, and it's even tighter now. And Barack Obama began to loosen that up, thinking, well, this is ridiculous. Why are we doing this 60 years later? And then Trump came along, and Republicans reinstituted it and made it even stronger. So that's really the foundation of what's been going on all this time is no, we won't give you any of this stuff. No, we won't sell you any of this stuff. We're still going to grind you down because you dared to stand up to us. Now, the two things you mentioned are also very crucial, but there's not as their effects have not been as long lasting. The first was the Bay of Pigs incident. And Bay of Pigs is the name of an actual bay on the island of Cuba. And because after Fidel Castro took over the country in 1959, a number of Cuban expatriates opposed him, but more importantly, the United States government as a whole opposed him. The US federal government assisted a group of Cuban expats slash refugees to go and land on the island at the Bay of Pigs with the CIA's approval and assistance to rebel, to lead a counter revolution against Fidel Castro with, again, American support. And it failed very quickly. And the Fidel Castro government captured all these guys, imprisoned them, put them on trial. I think some were expatriated, some of them were repatriated back to the United States. But when it came out that these guys were not just acting on their own as individual Cuban citizens, but with the assistance of the federal government of the United States, it became an international incident, which then strengthened Cuba resistance to the US. And at that time, since Russia, or the USSR, I should say, was buddying up to Cuba, which is part of the reason that the United States was angry about this. This then led to, or it bolstered, strengthened the connection between Cuba and the USSR to the point where Russia began installing nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba that could be fired against the United States. Now, the Russian attitude was, you, United States, through NATO, have installed nuclear missiles in Eastern European countries aimed at us in Russia. Therefore, we have the right to turn around and do that to you on the island of Cuba to protect ourselves, because this is the nuclear arms race. This is when we're on the verge of nuclear war. When the United States became aware of the nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba through not sabotage, but through espionage, as well as flights from U-2 spy airplanes flying over places and taking pictures from very high altitudes. And today we would do that through satellites, same situation. So the US finds out that these missiles are there, and there's a confrontation between the United States and the USSR, and there was an actual naval blockade around Cuba by the Americans to prevent a Russian ship from coming to Cuba. And that was the point that there could have been an international nuclear war. And that's the closest probably nuclear war has ever come to the entire planet. And the Russian ship turned around and went back, and the crisis ended. But yes, very few people are still alive who lived through that. And I did. I was 8 years old, and I actually remember it because it was such a big deal. And my parents actually looked into having a nuclear fallout shelter built here at our house where I'm sitting right now because of that particular crisis. And I also remember in school, people use the phrase duck and cover a lot, which was invented in the 1950s, in which we had drills when the sirens were tested on the first day of every month, as they still are, which we go through every month here in the Hawaiian Islands. We had to grab our sleeping mats, which we used for rest time, get under our desks and crunch all this sleeping mat over our heads so that we'd be protected from flying glass and debris. And that was all because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it made an impression even on me. But of course, I'm an old man now too. And so most people never heard of this. So that's part of the history of Cuba and the United States and why there's these feelings still exist. Although, of course, that was a long time ago and it's not as relevant now as people, it's kept alive This is kept alive by the Cuban expatriates and refugees who still bear the anger and the hurt of what they went through and the reason they want to overthrow the Cuban communist government.
Part of manifest destiny, I think, for Trump, but it's a bullying thing because they are obviously weak. And I guess, he's attracted to take over countries and institutions that don't fight back, that are weak, and they're not in a position to fight back right now. But query, suppose Diaz Canal, president of Cuba, called up China and said, "Look, we need your help. Come on over, help us out, just to give us greater presence against Trump."
And that's a very good point. The United States, for many decades, used to practice diplomacy and control through foreign aid, in which you go to the country and say, look, these are the problems you guys have. You don't have a lot of money. We, the United States, do have money. We have equipment. We have all of these things that we can help you with. Let us help you. We'll build a bridge for you. We'll build a road for you. We will supply food for you. We will supply medical aid. And by doing that, you get the good feelings of the people of that country. Not necessarily, I mean, you get both the government liking you and you get the population liking you when they say, look, we got emergency food aid from the United States. We like the United States. Well, that's what China is doing now, following in the footsteps of what the United States used to do. But during the current Trump administration, all of that foreign aid has been cut because it was considered to be wasting taxpayer money that isn't even being used to help Americans. And why are we giving all this money away for these foreigners, and paying for them to have shots, polio shots? We're going to cut all that. So all that's been cut off. Again, for vengeance, for who knows what reason, just to be juvenile and to be a bully. Well, into that void, China, of course, is thrilled. Great. We don't even have to be competing with the United States anymore. We can just go in and be the only people doing that. And Trump thinks, oh, no, bullying and aggression and insults are the only way to do this. You don't accomplish anything by being nice. You simply go on the attack, and that's how you take over. Well, so that's the situation we're in right now. It would have to, for China to step into Cuba's assistance at this point, would have to require a lot of careful consideration on the part of China, because would they really want to try to be provoking Donald Trump by doing this 90 miles away from Florida? And I'm not sure they would. But at the same time, but what Trump does have in his arsenal, again, are tariffs. China exports a lot to the United States. Trump has already told Mexico, if you provide oil to Cuba, we'll tariff you into, oblivion in trying to export to the United States. So that has made Mexico back down. Trump can do that to China as well. But China is a huge adversary. China is on the ascendant economically now, and the United States is on the descent economically now as the source of exported material. And just as an aside, if you look at the American car industry, which was for decades the hugest in the world, which is now dwindling and withering, and the China car industry is absolutely massive, and which is really going to wipe out, I think, Tesla as an electric car manufacturer, because they're so far ahead of Tesla now. But in any case, so China is not a weak little country. China has a lot of power now. But would China intentionally want to anger Trump and be right in his face? Most of the rest of the countries in the world are run by far more sensible people than Trump, by far more rational people than Trump. And all of those other countries know that Trump is so nuts that you really have to be careful in getting him worked up, because he can get worked up. And if he does, God knows what he's going to do.
What about Russia? What about a replay of the Russian missile crisis? It would be strategically advantageous for Putin to do that, even to suggest that he would do that. Is that in the cards? A replay of the Russian missile crisis?
I don't think it's in the cards, primarily because Russia is already mired in the Ukraine war. And Russia, I do not believe, has the resources, the men, or the ability to take on another potential crisis like that. They simply don't have the logistics to be able to do it. I don't think they've got the ships, for example, to be able to even bring a lot of stuff to Cuba if that was going to happen. But the other question is, would the leaders of Cuba risk having their country turned into a battlefield between Russia and the United States? And I don't think they would. And again, Donald Trump's illogic and potential violence, the creation of violence, which he could set upon anybody that he didn't like, is enough, I think, to put people off simply because they know you can't reason with him. Again, his outlook is juvenile and childish, but it's also that of a bully who has a tremendous amount of assets at his fingertips. So you don't want to get somebody that crazy worked up because you don't know what he might do. That works to his advantage, unfortunately, but it also drags the rest of us, the rest of the world, into his world, his demented mind.
Well, we got, quote, negotiations going on between the foreign minister of Cuba and Trump, or the State Department, which is run by a Cuban refugee, really. Marco Rubio is one of those people you talked about, happening right now. And nobody knows where that's going to go. But if you consider that Cuba is not getting any oil, that Mexico is not going to provide any oil, humanitarian help, okay, but not oil. So the cars, those old cars in Cuba aren't running. The power plants aren't running. It's an oil energy economy, just like Hawaii is. And, you can't run it very long without oil. There's nobody else providing oil. So the whole thing, which was in trouble before, as you said, for many years, is now in much greater trouble for the individual Cubans. It's just really sad, because everything they do is affected by the lack of oil, and they've been made into a kind of Caribbean pariah. So, these negotiations are negotiations where Trump approaches it from a position of almost absolute power, and the Cubans have the opposite. They don't have any power at all. And although the Cuban president says we want to retain our sovereignty, we're not going to allow regime change. We are in fact building strategies to oppose the United States should it put boots on the ground here in Cuba. Although he says that, that's very weak rhetoric. And so I ask you, what are the choices? What are the options for both sides? How are these negotiations going to work out? It sounds to me like Trump will simply take over Cuba. There will be regime change. There will be a change in economic control, political control, and he will have whatever he wants. And the American capital formations that were there before will have a free opportunity to come back and take what they lost or build new versions of it. And yes, in Havana, there will be the Trump Hotel, for example. And all through this, it's so remarkable, all through this, Guantanamo persists. Guantanamo, for which the United States has paid or has been required to pay $4,000 per annum for the military base, which administration after administration has persisted, to keep there. The checks go to Havana every year for $4,000, but Cuba hasn't cashed them. So, what's going to happen with these quote? I put quotes around it. These quote negotiations.
No, you're absolutely right. The United States has full control. The United States has fully the upper hand. Cuba has no negotiating status in this situation at all. And historically speaking, me being a historian, I look back at this and it's like what was happening 120 years ago in Cuba. Cuba was a Spanish colony. Cuba was taken over by the United States after it won the Spanish American War in 1898. And for the early parts of that time period, the United States ran Cuba. For a time, they left Cuba, but then came back because they said, "You're not running it right. We got to come back and take over again." And for a long time, there was something in sort of the agreement between Cuba and the United States called the Platt Amendment. And the Platt Amendment said, Cuba, you are on notice that anytime the United States doesn't like what's happening in your country economically or politically, we have the right to come back and take over anytime we want. And so that was something that was very offensive to Cuban citizens, of course, and it was dropped by the 1950s. But even though by the 1950s the United States didn't claim that it had the power to march back in and take over, the United States controlled Cuba economically through outright ownership of land, through the running much of their sugarcane industry, through ownership of their big hotels, through ownership of their electric company and their telephone company. And so Cuba was very much under the heel of the USA during that entire time. And when Castro took over, there was a real growth of Cuban nationalism and Cuban pride in saying, we are pushing the United States out. We're not going to be under their boot heel anymore. We're going to make our own way in the world. Now, ironically, as a small country, they really weren't capable of doing that, and they had to transfer all of that allegiance that they had to the USA to Russia to keep them going. And Russia kept Cuba going for up until the collapse of the entire Russian Empire in 1990. And since then, they've been struggling along with no money and no power and no nothing. Well, at this point, the United States owns all the cards. I agree with you that I think we're going to see a regime change in Cuba forced by the USA. And the sad thing is that a number of people are going to greet that with open arms and say, yes, United States, what a great thing you've done, without acknowledging, no, this is the United States pushing people around as a bully. However, all those Cuban expats who hate Castro and his legacy are going to be cheering and saying, yay, viva Cuba. Now we're free again. And in a way, they will be. But I do think, again, as I said, and I think as you just mentioned too, Cuba is ripe for Americans to rush in and exploit again. That's my point. 120 years ago, this is what was happening. Americans were taking over the Cuban sugarcane industry and exporting all of the sugar it produced to the United States. So they were controlling the entire flow of money. They were making money for themselves. And that's what's going to happen again. Cuba doesn't have the power to resist that. Americans are going to be flooding in, buying everything, grabbing everything, exploiting everything. Again, paying people minimum wages because they're so desperate to work. They don't have to be paid any decent amount of money. Whatever Americans give them, it's going to be more than they're getting right now. So Cubans, again, are going to find themselves under the thumb of the United States economically. And it's very bizarre for me, again, as a historian, to see history repeating itself this way, because that's what Cubans managed to shake off to a degree, even though they replaced that control of the United States with control of the USSR. And now we're back again. The circle is back repeating itself, which I just look on upon this and think, I never thought I would see this happen. Everything I thought was that I've ever read about Cuba was, no, that is all part of the past. And no, it's not. Smaller countries get taken over by bigger countries. Smaller countries get overtaken by their neighboring big countries. And that's what's happened. And by the way, and you and I have discussed this, ironically, there is a parallel between the Hawaiian Islands and Cuba in being taken over by the United States. And the Hawaiian Islands got taken over by the USA and have never been relinquished. And so that's probably not something that's going to change. Cuba got taken over by the USA. It was relinquished to a degree. It was actively fought against, and now it's coming back.
In a larger sense, though, this is a sign of the times. This is the end, or a badge of the end of the liberal world order, where sovereignty makes no difference. It's power that makes a difference, and you can have regime change. You can take over. The big guys can take over the little guys. And I suggest to you, DeSoto, that this is going to happen again. It's going to happen again in Latin America. It's happened in Venezuela. It's going to happen in other countries. And like it or not, Cuba is going to be it's going to be regime change. It's going to be owned by the U.S. And that sends a message worldwide. It says you don't have to respect borders. You don't have to respect sovereignty. And the strong will eat the weak. And I think this is going to be a huge statement, a part of the change that we are living through. Don't you agree?
Oh, I agree completely. And in terms of political theater and in terms of publicity and in terms of showing how big and strong we are, big gorillas beating our chests, and we're going to take over you. This is, again, as you just said, an example. We're setting another example. You other people, don't get in our way. Greenland, Denmark. We just did this to Cuba. We, the big, tough Americans, we did it to Cuba. Now we can do it to you. Are you going to negotiate, or are we going to do all these other bad things we can do to you? And yes, all of this is happening. And I agree with you completely. And it's not stopping. But how long this is sustainable in the United States politically, I don't know. And that's the crucial thing. If we're even allowed to have midterm elections in 2026, because again, that's not we just assume it's going to happen, but no, it may not. But if it does, and if the Republicans lose as badly as they might be losing, the shift of power in the US may bring an end to all of this. Now, Trump will still be president, but if the legislative side of the government is able to assert itself strongly enough, if it's controlled by Democrats, some of this might be reined in or stopped. However, that's part of the insanity of 2026. We have no idea what may or may not happen. We have no idea if things will change, and if they do change, how they will change, because there's a ton of other questions involved in this. And it isn't just the legislative branch of the government, because we know the executive branch isn't going to change for the moment. And even if the legislative branch changes, the judiciary is still up in the air, particularly the Supreme Court. So all of those elements will be in play for whether this imperialist bullying continues or not. And Cuba is the current focus of the imperialist bullying by Trump, but it's not going to stay that way.
I want to mention one other thing that comes up on this. The thing about Venezuela is it has resources, not really, used over the past few decades, but it does have oil, and so there's a reason to come in and take control of those assets, and that sort of changes the paradigm from what was happening, and it makes it very different in Cuba, where Cuba still grows sugarcane, but that's really not a major asset in the world today, the world of agriculture. There's other places that grow sugarcane. So Cuba can't offer oil, and it can't offer any particular resource. So what happens then? And you talk about legislative priorities in the U.S. You take over a country, we will own the result. We will own Cuba, and we will have to spend enormous amounts of money. The best that we can do is achieve some sort of secondary type of Puerto Rico where we throw towels at people and we don't help them. So that's one thing. It will remain marginal because Congress will not, this administration will not provide the funding to rebuild Cuba or even to build it to a humanitarian level. And it will be very tragic. And we'll see what the US is really made of when it doesn't provide that funding, where it doesn't rebuild what it owns. This is going to happen soon, I suggest. But the other thing is, I wanted to make you Secretary of State. I wanted to offer you the opportunity to determine foreign policy with respect to Cuba, because it is an inflection point. It is a sample of what could happen in these, American states, all the American states, all of Latin America. We haven't really helped them. History will show that we haven't helped them. And as a result, you have people clamoring at the border, and you have all these border issues and immigration issues and the like. We could have helped them. To some limited degree, Barack Obama tried to help them. He didn't get very far because Congress was not supporting him in his efforts to help Cuba. If you were Secretary of State, what would you do now? Not only for Cuba, but for Latin America, to help them achieve, the proper use of their resources, to help them develop democratic institutions, to help them stand on their own, to help them in foreign relations with us and other countries in the world, and to help them resist the incursions by those who James Monroe would have wished to stay out of town. And I just wonder what your thought is. What is good foreign policy with respect to Cuba, which stands as a sample, which stands as which could stand as a way to achieve a much better organization of American states?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right. The United States has treated everything south of the border of North America as something to exploit, not to work with, but to work on and to take advantage of and to squeeze assets out of for the enrichment of the United States without caring what happens to the people there. And that, the term banana republic is indicative of that entire situation in which banana companies literally created and destroyed countries to grow their product. But the main problem now is, and we just kind of touched on it, we're in a political situation now in which it is pretty much impossible to convince people, certainly in the Trump administration and a good chunk of the population of the United States, that working diplomatically, working in a humanitarian way, working with people rather than against them, working to help build people up is a sign of weakness. And it's a sign of wasting money. And it's a sign of using taxpayer money that doesn't benefit the United States taxpayers themselves. So that's all been shut down. As I said, humanitarian aid, international aid has been killed by the Trump administration to the cheers and support of the MAGA people. So the first big problem is, how do you get beyond that? How do you convince Americans who are going to pay for it that this actually benefits them? And one of the important ways is, if you say that people are flooding across our border and these evil illegal immigrants are all criminals and they're drug dealers and they're rapists and all this stuff, which they've all been painted as being. And that's the justification for ICE to go around throughout the United States and terrorize people, because all these bad people are coming into the country. And millions of Americans totally accept that and totally believe that. Well, one of the ways, the root cause of that, if in fact people are still coming across the border illegally, is because economically there's a better life in the United States than there is in their own home country. So if you put your efforts into assisting their home country so they don't have to leave, so that they have a stable government that respects them as citizens and they can earn a living, decent wage in their own home, they'll stay in their own home. And so if the USA puts effort into trying to help those people, and if there's going to be regime change, to do it in a positive way through humanitarian ways, through diplomacy and helping people, you're going to win people over that way. The ways that you don't if you go in there and threaten them and insult them and tell them they're stupid and tell them they're ugly and tell them they're all bad and you have to crush them and push them out. Well, do you think that's going to make you a popular person, a popular country? No, it's going to make them hate you. Therefore, they're going to do bad things to you because they hate you because you started it out. You started it. Well, if the USA could be convinced, which is an uphill, if not impossible battle, that the way to combat these problems is to do this rather than shaking your fist and insulting them, then maybe there's a chance that could happen. Your statement about Puerto Rico is incredibly appropriate here because the United States already has possession of another Caribbean country, another Caribbean island, which also was a Spanish colony, just as Cuba was. Puerto Rico became part of the United States at the same time that Cuba did because of the Spanish-American War. Well, Puerto Rico today is this strange appendage to the United States in which it's not one or the other. And it's, again, economically depressed and in a bad situation. And the USA treats it like it's another one of these third world countries where we can go in and maybe, go to a hotel and leave. And we don't have to do anything else about it. So you're absolutely right that if the USA was to take over Cuba, that's a huge financial burden. What are you going to do about if you physically take it over? Now you have to feed everybody. Now you have to bring in oil. But it isn't just that you bring in oil or you let them, pay for oil. Their refineries are all trashed. Their electric generating plants are all trashed. They're all old. They don't work anymore. They're all broken. Where's the money going to come from to do that, Donald Trump, if you really take over Cuba? Now, obviously, Donald Trump doesn't care about anything humanitarian. So if they still don't have any electricity, he isn't going to care. Cuba has no assets. So what is the USA getting in return for the takeover and the supposed creation of freedom, economic and political freedom? I think, again, it's going to be offered to American capitalist investors, companies, free market enterprise people to flood in to exploit it and earn money for their companies. There will not be humanitarian aid on a large scale. It will simply be, here, you guys who have money, here, you guys who are investors and developers, Cuba is now waiting for you to get in there and do whatever you want. You want to build a casino? Go ahead. You want to build a hotel? Go ahead. You want to build, you want to money launder? Go ahead. You want to use this as a place for illicit substances? Go right ahead, and we'll look the other way. I think that's probably what's going to happen. The USA is not going to walk in and say, we're going to help you, Cubans. We're sorry for you and we want to help you. It's going to be, all right, everybody, Cuba's now open. We've kicked out that regime. We've shut it down. And now international investors, you come in and do what you want, and you make damn sure you thank the United States for giving you this gift to exploit and make money from, because here it is waiting for you.
Wow, that's not a pretty picture. Well, thank you for those thoughts. Thank you for this kind of analysis. We all need to make this analysis going forward, and we need to watch it going forward. But for now, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you to our co-host, DeSoto Brown. I'm Jay Fidell, host of Connecting the Dots. In this episode, we have discussed Trump versus Cuba. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha, DeSoto.
Aloha, Jay. Aloha, everybody.